Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 20, Early Kabbalistic Literature, Book 4, The Written Word of Kabalism, First Period, from the Doctrine and Literature of the Kabalah by Arthur Edward Waite. Book 4, The Written Word of Kabalism, First Period, Argument. The traces of Kabbalistic literature outside the Sepher Yetzirah and prior to the publication of the Zohar are enumerated briefly to indicate that there was a gradual growth of the tradition and to correct exaggerated notions concerning it. There are several ancient treatises which connect with Kabbalism, but are not regarded by modern scholarship as Kabbalistic in the technical sense. This is the case with the Sepher Yetzirah itself, but there is no doubt that all these works pretend to embody an occult tradition, or that it was the elements of oral tradition which subsequently received development from the commentators on the Sepher Yetzirah, as well as from the Zohar, and later still, from the expositors of Zoharic mysteries. The attention of early Kabbalists was concentrated on the Book of Formation, and numerous elucidations of that work appeared between the 11th and 13th centuries. 1. Early Kabbalistic literature. It is beyond controversy that there was a great body of mystic speculation and doctrine grown up in Jewry, of which the roots are to be found in the Talmud, while it is connected occasionally with brilliant and even with some great names. It is this transcendentalism which led ultimately to the Zohar, and should scholarship forbid us to confer on it the distinctive denomination of Kabbalism, we must defer to scholarship, though with the mental reservation that if the question be more than of words, it is at most one of stages of growth, for that which was of mysticism in Israel between the period of the Talmud and the period of the promulgation of the Zohar is that which in the course of its evolution became the Kabalah and the Zohar. The title of this section is to some extent tentative or speculative, but the modest conclusions of the previous book are a sufficient warrant for supposing that there are traces of Kabbalism outside the Sepher Yetzirah prior to the promulgation of the Zohar, and possessing some literary remains. It is indeed essential to the natural history of the later work that it should have had its antecedents in literature. According to the most acceptable view, these were certain midrashim, which, for the most part, are not now extant, and it is fair to suppose that assuming such memorials, they must have exercised some influence. So also the Sepher Yetzirah, whatever the date ascribed to it, was of high authority, and the veneration in which it was held was of the kind which creates literature. We must beware, however, of supposing that there was an unbroken line of Kabbalists from the 2nd to the 12th century, as some occult writers have pretended. Supposing the Sepher Yetzirah in its present form to be later than the 2nd century, we must regard as its prototype a work already mentioned under the title of the Alphabet of Akiba, while the antithesis of the Book of Occupation, one of the most important sections of the Zohar, must be sought in the anthropomorphic skeur komahi, that is, the measure of the height, in other words, the description of the body of God, or development of the various scriptural places in which the divine members are mentioned. The dates of these fragmentary works are conjectural, but there can be no doubt, as indeed there is no question, of their comparative antiquity. Connected with these are the Greater and the Lesser Palace, known also as the delineation of the heavenly temples, which in common with the others is not regarded by modern critics as Kabbalistic, but it is allowed that all were instrumental in calling the Kabalah into existence. In accordance with the exigencies of his standpoint, Dr. Graetz, who may be taken to represent all that is most acrid and uncompromising in hostility to Jewish mysticism, fixes the origin of Kabbalism as to its date in the 10th century, and thus by implication denies the claim of the Sepher Yetzirah to be included in its literature. He is followed, as we have seen, by Ginsberg, but it is not open to question that the work is indispensable to the Kabalah, or that it is an integral and fundamental part thereof. The 10th century is, however, an important period in Jewish history and Jewish letters, for at this epoch, the quickening of the Arabian mind was followed by that of Israel, and was sometimes eclipsed thereby. There was for a moment a lull in persecution. The academies in the East flourished, and in the West the internecine struggle of Christians and Muslims in Spain ensured a breathing space to the children of the exile. Prior to that period, from the 6th century and onward, there was a hiatus in the literature of Israel. The canons of the Talmud were closed by the terror and peril of the time rather than inherent necessity, and the history of Israel became one of bitter struggle for existence. A certain hazardous shelter was found under Persian dominion, and ultimately the intellectual lamp of Israel shone forth clearly and steadily during the Muslim domination of Spain, which country from that period till the beginning of the 13th century was like a second Palestine to the Jew. And this land of refuge, under the tolerant and enlightened sway of the Spanish caliphs, became almost as dear to his heart as the land of promise. Montpellier in France and Salerno in Italy were famous for their Jewish schools, but that of Seville was perhaps more illustrious than either. Spain also was a nursing land of Kabalistic literature, and the traces of the esoteric tradition between the epoch which produced the Book of Formation and that of the Book of Splendor must be sought chiefly therein. Though in the 12th century something may be gleaned from southern France and earlier still from Gaon, who flourished in the 11th century, a Babylonian, on the borders of the Caspian Sea. There is neither space nor occasion here to produce a bibliographical list, and indeed the materials at our command can scarcely be regarded as extensive, serving mainly to correct false and highly colored impressions regarding the claims of Kabbalistic tradition. The chief names of the period with which we are now concerned are: 1. Rabbi Eliezer, whose mystic system as presented in the Pirkei connects on the one hand with the Sepher Yetzirah and on the other with Zoharic teaching. We have in the first place God subsisting prior to the creation of the world alone with his ineffable name. Next, the creation prior to the visible world of the Torah or law, together with the throne of glory, the name of the Messiah, paradise, hell, and the temple of Jerusalem, that is, the archetype of the earthly temple. Subsequently, the creation of the world by means of 10 words. With this work may be connected the ancient Midrash Conan, which represents the Torah as the foundation of the universe. It is a matter of conjecture whether these works are slightly later or earlier than the Sepher Yetzirah. 2. The Gaon Sadia, head of the Persian Academy of Sora, was the author of a commentary on the Sepher Yetzirah preserved in the Bodleian Library and only printed recently in France, as we shall see in the 3rd section of this book. 3. The Gaon Shirira, head of the Academy of Ferretz Shibur in the neighborhood of Babylon, was perhaps more distinguished for the violence with which he wrote against the Christians than for his Kabbalistic knowledge. But Nachmanides has preserved his observations on the delineation of the heavenly temples, or more correctly on the fragments which it embodies under the title of the proportion of the height, otherwise called the description of the body of God, which shows the Kabbalistic leanings of Shirira and creates the antithesis to the anthropomorphism of these early works, which has been mentioned already as a keynote of Kabbalism. God forbid, he exclaims, that man should speak of the Creator as if he had bodily members and dimensions. This rabbi was despoiled of his wealth and hanged by order of Kedar, caliph of the race of the Abbasides. 4. The Gan-He, son and successor of Shirira as the head of the Babylonian school of Shibur, is also credited with a commentary on the Sepher Yetzirah, which will be dealt with in its proper place. The interpretation of dreams was one of the daily occupations of the Jewish academies, and their skill exhibited therein, or the credulity of the times, often purchased toleration and respect for the rabbis at the hands of the caliphs. To Rab Hay is attributed a treatise on this art, which was printed at Venice. Outside his alleged commentary on the Book of Formation, his voluminous works have many Kabbalistic references, especially that entitled The Voice of God in Its Power. It will be sufficient to mention among these the doctrine of correspondences, of man as a microcosm, and a peculiar theory of mystic contemplation. He possessed enormous influence and became subsequently the head of the Academy of Pumbedita in the neighborhood of Baghdad. He died in 1038-5. Ar-Chazdef was a prince of the exile and temporal head of the Jews in Cordova. He was also a political minister under 2 caliphs. He is said to connect the school of Hagan with that of Geberel. 6. Solomon ben Yehuda ibn Geberel, the scholastic Avispron, and in all respects, Kabbalistic and otherwise, a focus of intellectual and literary interest, was a contemporary of the famous Nagrila. 7. Abraham ben David, or ben Dior HaLevi, the great Orthodox apologist of the 12th century, has been included in the chain of Kabbalism. 8. Moses ibn Jacob ben Ezra, one of the greatest Jews of his time, was of Granada and flourished in the earlier part of the 12th century. His work entitled The Garden of Aromatics shows traces of the doctrine of Geberol, but it appears by his commentary on Isaiah that he was in disagreement with this doctor. Basnage says that he did not reject the Kabalah, though he knew its weakness, because he did not wish to be embroiled with contemporary writers. He wrote upon the divine name and the mystic attributes of numbers in connection therewith. 9. The names of Judah Halevi, who has some references to the Sepher Yetzirah in his work entitled Kusari, of Jacob Nazir, of Solomon Jarki, of R. Abraham ben David the Younger, bring us to the 13th century and to the period of A. Maimonides, who is reported, chiefly on the authority of R. Chaim, to have turned Kabbalist at an advanced age, but in any case connects with mysticism, and was acquainted at least with the existence of the twofold mystic tradition, distinguished as that of the creation and that of the chariot. B.R. Azariel, of Valladolid, famous commentator on the Sepher Yetzirah, see Shem Tob ibn Falaquera, a disciple of Maimonides, who connects with Geberol. D. R. Abraham Abulafia, who wrote on the Tetragrammaton and the mysteries of the law, but his works have not been published. He endeavored to combine the theoretical and practical schools, but he was a quixotic adventurer and a messianic enthusiast, to whose opinions it is unnecessary to give weight. It may be noted, however, that he exhibits some Christian tendencies. Those who defend the authenticity of Kabbalistic tradition find something to their purpose in all these writers and personalities, but they often proceed on a misconception. What, for example, is more likely to lead an unpracticed student astray than the treatise of Abraham ben David Halevi by the mere fact of its title? It is called Seder ha-Kabalah, the order of the tradition. As a fact, it is the least mystical of all productions, and though I have termed its author a great orthodox apologist, he had a strong Aristotelian leaven. The occasion of his book was a Sadducean heresy prevalent in Castile and Leon, and represented by the work of Abu Alfrag, which maintained that the true synagogue was to be found among the Sadducees. The Seder ha-Kabalah vindicates the authority of the orthodox claim under the two heads of succession and universality or community of doctrine among all the synagogues. It embraces the entire history of the Jewish Church and the perpetuation of the Mosaic doctrine, which is the tradition named in the title. The work of Abraham ben David Halevi is perhaps greater than was the occasion which called it forth. The Jews were divided among themselves upon many questions, of which Sadducean pretensions were certainly not the most important. The great distinction of the time for the purpose of our own inquiry was between the Jews who had adopted Aristotelian principles and the Jews who opposed the innovation. The Enlightenment and culture were incontrovertibly on the side of the former. The fascination of mystic thought, in a word, all that we connect with the ideal of rabbinical Israel, went, however, into the opposite scale. There were great names on both sides. Rabbi Abraham and his Sepher exercised a large influence. His contemporary Maimonides, who survived him by almost a quarter of a century, was described by the enthusiasts of his period as the elect of the human race. And by a play upon his name, it was said of him that from Moses to Moses there was no one like unto Moses. The rival school was to some extent represented by Avisbron, and some of those who assert that the Zohar incorporated traditions belonging to preceding centuries are content to rest their case on the writings of this poet and philosopher. The evidence, however, is in a very confused state. On the one hand, the system of Avisbron has many Aristotelian traces. On the other hand, it has been asserted that Maimonides has much to connect him with Avisbron, though he was not acquainted with his works. While further, the great masterpiece of the Talmudic Jew of Cordova, entitled The Guide of the Perplexed, offers many indications of his sympathy with the speculative Kabalah. In a general sense, however, those who wished to introduce Aristotelian principles into Jewish philosophy belonged to that school which subsequently opposed the Zohar, as for example Abraham ibn Wakar of Toledo, at the beginning of the 14th century, while those who accepted the Zohar belonged to that school which connects with Avisbron, among whom was Rabbi Abraham ben David of Poskier, to whom one section of modern criticism attributes the invention of the Kabalah, and Isaac the Blind, with his disciples Azariel and Ezra, whose superior claim is favored by Ginsburg. The Kabbalistic interests of this school are outside all debate. It prized the Sepher Yetzirah, and one of the most important commentaries on that treatise was produced within it. When we investigate the claim made with regard to Avis Brun, we must not be discouraged at finding that writers like Isaac Meyer have much enhanced the real strength of his Kabbalistic connections. We find, it is true, the doctrines of the inaccessible God, of the intermediaries between God and the universe, of the emanation of the world, and even of the universal knowledge attributed to the pre-existent soul of man by all Jewish mysticism. But what we should like to meet with in a mystic of the 11th century is a distinct trace of typical Zoharic doctrine, let us say that of the countenances and not Yetziratic references, Sephirotic correspondences and so forth. The latter are to be expected at the middle of the 11th century, and in this case the former are wanting. There remains, however, sufficient to interest us, perhaps even to warrant the inclusion of Gabriel among the precursors of Zoharic Kabbalism, and a short account of this author may be appended as a conclusion to this section. At that period, when the influence of Arabian imagination was infused into the romantic literature of Western Europe, scholastic philosophy and theology were receiving the tincture of Arabian thought. But as, on the one hand, this tincture was received sometimes without much consciousness of its origin, so, on the other, influences were occasionally referred to Arabian sources which were in reality referable only to the Spanish Jews living under the protection of the Caliphate during the Muslim domination of the peninsula. A case in point was the once renowned Avis Brun, whose identity with Solomon ben Yehuda ibn Gebirol, a Jew of Cordova, was first demonstrated by Monk in the early part of the present century. His chief treatise, entitled The Fountain of Life, in a Latin version ascribed to the middle of the 12th century, became widely diffused. Albertus Magnus, St. Thomas of Aquin, and Duns Scotus all cited it. And it is said to sum the philosophy of the 13th century. According to Renan, Avis Brun preceded the school of Arabian philosophy which arose in Spain. He wrote philosophy in Arabic and poetry in Hebrew. The Jews valued his poetry, but his metaphysics were not in repute among them. The Christian scholastics adopted his philosophical ideas and knew nothing whatever of his verses. By both classes of his admirers, he was respectively celebrated as the greatest philosopher and the greatest poet of his time. But the nominalists denounced him. Realists like Duns Scotus entailed on him their own condemnation. While he is said to have exercised an influence upon the mystics of the Middle Ages, he was proscribed by the University of Paris at the period of the publication of the Zohar on the ground that he favored Aristotle. When the school of Averroes arose, he was unknown among it. At a later period, he was unknown to Maimonides. He was unknown also to the encyclopedic learning of Picus de Mirandola, and on the threshold of the Reformation, his memory may be said to have perished at the pyre of Giordano Bruno. Avis Brun was born about the year 1021 at Malaga. He was educated in the University of Saragossa, and he died at Valencia in 1070. He was patronized by Nagdila, that is, Samuel Halevi, ben Joseph ibn Agrela, a prince of the exile, who was also Prime Minister of Spain under the Caliphate of Habus. Nagdila was the center and mainspring of Jewish learning in that country, and it is thought that through him the sacred tradition of the Hebrews was communicated to Avis Brun, at a period when the Zohar and its connections were still in course of formation. It seems certain in any case that some of the conceptions and the system incorporated in these books may be found in his writings, more especially in The Fountain of Life and The Crown of the Kingdom. The first is affirmed to be the earliest known exhibition of the secrets of the speculative Kabalah. The second, composed towards the end of his life, is a hymn celebrating the only one and true God and the marvels of his creation. The existence of the Zoharic tradition some centuries previous to the time of Moses de Leon, the reputed forger of the Zohar, has been rested, among other supports, on the writings of this Spanish Jew, and he seems to have been acquainted indubitably with the Book of Formation. In the second book and 22nd section of the Fountain of Life, this passage occurs. Hence it hath been said that the construction of the world was accomplished by the inscription of numbers and letters in the air, which is obviously the fundamental notion of the Kabbalistic work in question. The table of the 32 paths, which arises out of the Book of Formation, was the theme of one of his poems. Whether the later Kabbalists derived from Avishbron, or both from a common source, cannot be conclusively determined, but having regard to the Jewish indifference for his philosophical writings, and to the probable existence of a vast mass of floating esoteric tradition, there can be no doubt as to the direction in which probability points. The connection between Avishbron and the Kabalah is not sufficiently explicit upon the surface of the Fountain of Life to have attracted the attention of critics like Ernest Renan. While Kabbalistic critics refer the system which it develops to the 10 Sephiroth, others suppose it to be based on the 10 categories of Aristotle, a pantheism analogous to that of the early realists. On the one hand, says Renan, his application of peripatetic principles to Mosaic doctrine alarmed the theologians. On the other hand, his concessions to orthodoxy concerning the creation and the free will of the Creator did not satisfy the extreme peripatetic Jews. Of his alleged Kabbalistic connections, Renan was either unaware, as already suggested, or they were ignored by him. An impartial examination of the Fountain of Life makes the pantheism of Avishbron less apparent than his Kabbalistic correspondences. So far from identifying the universe with God, it establishes no uncertain contrast between them in order to bridge the abyss and to make it conceivable that one derived being from the other. He supposes 9 intermediaries plus the divine will through which the absolutely existing, who is above number, is attached to its corporeal universe. The analogies which this conception offers to Yetziratic doctrine are self-evident and do not need enforcing, and yet our impartial judgment must pronounce the philosophy of Avishbron to be of Greek rather than Jewish complexion. It is at least clear that the Fons Vitae, which is a dialogue after the manner of Plato, is tinctured deeply by Hellenic thought. Modern scholarship has recognized 3 chief schools which led up to Zoharic Kabbalism. A. That of Isaac the Blind, to which belongs Azariel with his celebrated commentary on the Sepher Yetzirah. B. That of Eliezer of Worms, which is largely of the theurgic order. And C. That of Abulafia, which to some extent united the preceding and made use of the theurgic formulae combined with contemplation to achieve union with God. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.